blurs. The bokeh blur, or lens blur, is another transition that can be done entirely in camera. You'll end one shot by going out of focus and begin the next shot by going into focus. Now, this does mean you're going to have to plan ahead of time if you want to do this transition in this way. But if you, the editor, don't have any shots like this, and you still want to do a blur transition, you can. A blur with bokeh is going to simulate a real lens blur, just not as good as the real thing, bokeh. But there's also linear blur, radial blur, Gaussian blur, box blur, zoom blur, and whatever kind of blur this is from Pixelland. Here's one example of real lens blur from my Eclipse road trip. This was actually accidental. My phone doesn't have manual focus control, and it was trying to focus on raindrops on the window right in front of me. I liked the result, so I used it to transition to the next shot. So that's what a blur transition is simulating, but as far as the language of cinema goes, I don't think it really means much. But okay, what could it mean? Skipping forward or backward in time? Maybe, sometimes. Going on a drunken bender in Vegas? Oh yeah, that'll work. Getting drugged or tranquilized? Yes. Carefree summer days, road tripping with attractive friends in a Volkswagen? Yes. Here's an example I found all the way back in the 60s. Well, it's more of a rack focus than a transition, but they did use it to make this product appear, which was pretty clever. Here's an in-camera blur dissolving into another shot that does not begin with a blur. It works. And here's a mosaic effect cutting to a blurred shot, which resolves itself into focus. That's right, you can mix some transitions together. Is your mind blown? The blur transition actually works for a lot of things. And unlike the light leaks transition, you absolutely can use it for smaller elements within the frame. As usual, keep in mind that at full screen, this transition looks different when it is applied only to the head of a clip, only to the tail of a clip, and when placed between two clips. Now, I've found that the directional blur, in particular, is more useful than the typical Gaussian blur. I used to use it all the time for Tech Quickie videos, both for full screen transitions and for smaller objects. It looks especially good with some chromatic aberration. Here, I used it as bookends to go to and then from a short segment where I explain how many colors are available in different systems. I think that worked really well. Here, I used it to go from a website back to A-roll, and I did the same thing here. Here, I mixed a linear blur with a bit of VHS damage and a slow Gaussian unblur. We gettin' fancy now, and here I used a linear blur to transition Colton onto the desktop of a computer. I also made him more blue to match his surroundings, though I think I overdid it. I actually used a lot of linear blurs in that episode. What sound effects to use? I've actually never used a sound effect with a full screen blur transition, but you have to remember that all of my advice is being filtered through years of, oh god, we gotta get the video done now! So I just haven't taken the time to figure this particular thing out. I'm sure a whoosh sound would work fine as usual. They work for almost everything else. Or you could have some very subtle mechanical clicking or motor noises that would just come from a lens refocusing. Or you could just go crazy and try all sorts of different stuff. Foley is a whole art unto itself, and you'd be surprised just how many sound effects are made out of things that are completely different from what you see on screen. Did you know that the Star Wars laser sound is just a guy wire being hit with a wrench? Now you do. Where to get them? Premiere and NewBlue don't even have one. Maxon Universe has channel blur, which is weird and kind of interesting, and exposure blur, which is actually decent. And you can use just the exposure or just the blur. You can even use zoom blur if you want to, but you can't change the center, which makes me a sad panda. Boris FX Sapphire's dissolve blur is disappointing, actually, with only parameters for vertical and or horizontal blur, and no angle change. Boris FX Continuum has lots of great offerings, such as spin blur, we'll talk about this later, directional blur, which lets you blur the color channels separately for some reason, which I don't think looks good, RGB blur, which also lets you blur the color channels separately, but it looks better this time. Unfortunately, there's no angle parameter. Vector blur, which is a bit too wild for Boris FX. And finally, the excellent Lens Blur Dissolve, which is just about as good as you can get without doing it for real in camera. There are so many great options in here. You can even change the number of sides on the iris, and look at a little preview with this checkbox, boost the highlights, and best of all, you have these extra compositing options, which you can use if you only want one of the shots blurred. This means you don't have to do it by simply using this transition only on one clip, where you'll run into the stupid linear compositing problem. They really thought of everything. Also, if you do want to blur both sources, I think applying the blur to source and reveal looks better than dissolve. Here's some real bokeh done in camera. Here's Continuum's bokeh, Sapphire's bokeh from the dissolve defocus transition, Maxon Universe's bokeh, and here's Film Impact's bokeh. It's the worst one. Its blur amount parameter is too limited, and unlike the others, it doesn't really have any way to make the highlights pop out, which is kind of the whole reason you'd want a bokeh blur in the first place. Film Impact's blur to color is one of the 4 transitions you can get for free, but you can't get rid of the color, so I've literally never used it. There we go. I fixed your website for you. Fortunately, the other 3 free transitions are actually good. The directional blur from Film Impact is great, and you've already seen me use it in numerous examples. Note that it has chromatic aberration and exposure controls, and if you want to get a little bit crazy with it, you can even animate an angle change during the blur. Well, you can do that with any parameter in most transitions, but it's usually not worthwhile. The one thing it doesn't have is separate X and Y blur values, like Boris FX Continuum's BCC plus directional blur dissolve. See how that one still follows the direction, but you can make the blur more or less streaky, for lack of a better word? It's not necessary, but this is a nice feature to have. Last but not least, Pixelan's Blur Master. These transitions are absolutely buck wild. This is one transition with 750 presets, most of which are absolutely insane. And they load and render really fast. I could not possibly talk about all of these, so I'm just going to keep clicking on them to show you the previews. Most of these are not worth using, but if you ever want something crazy, it's in here. Sadly, there is not a bokeh-based blur. That's basically the one and only thing I would say is missing from this pack, which is unfortunate. I would buy it for a good bokeh blur alone. It's only $39 to own this forever, and it's got some good linear blurs if that's what you need. But I'll talk more about Pixelan in a dedicated video. Also, Pixelan has the OrganiBlur for people who think the Blur Master doesn't go far enough. I don't know why you would want these, but they exist. How to make it yourself. Premiere Pro has 3 non-obsolete blur effects that you can use as transitions if you keyframe them. Let's start with the Gaussian blur. You can put it directly onto a clip, but I prefer to just use an adjustment layer most of the time. So grab an adjustment layer, place it above a cut, and trim it to your desired length. I'm going to make this one perfectly centered. Put the Gaussian blur effect on the adjustment layer, and for the blurriness parameter, make keyframes at the beginning, middle, and end. Increase the value of the middle keyframe to taste. I used 40, but later increased that to 80. Make sure repeat edge pixels is on, or the edges will get darker, which you don't want. And you can ease the beginning and end keyframes if you really want to. However, there is one problem. Watching it back, you can pretty clearly see the cut happening underneath all of that blur. But hey, don't worry, you can just put a cross dissolve on there and resize it to be a bit smaller than the adjustment layer. That's a perfect fix. I also recommend that you put a marker on the adjustment layer's center keyframe so it'll snap to the footage underneath. And presto, you've got yourself a portable blur transition that you can copy and paste anywhere. Now, you can do the same thing with the directional blur, but we have a problem. There's no option for repeat edge pixels, which results in dark edges, and that's pretty annoying. I came up with my own workaround for that, but don't bother because Mr. Horse taught me a better way. Just grab the alpha adjust effect and check on ignore alpha. Ta-da! It's fixed! Amazing! This is so much easier than all this garbage. Last and least, Premiere Pro's camera blur not only doesn't look very much like a real camera blur, but also does not work if you try to keyframe it on an adjustment layer. This is a bug, and don't hold your breath on it ever getting fixed. Let's move on before I lose what's left of my sanity. You just watched one chapter from a longer transitions tutorial, which you can also watch right now for free from the link below, or just click this little thingy on screen right now. The tutorial covers nearly every useful transition and every transitions vendor. I'll see you there.